Hello, and thanks for listening to these stories of the strange, unexplained, and uncanny. I'm John Harford, and I'll be your guide through these mists of Mirkwood. This is another episode that features a few more short ghost stories set in and around Chattanooga, Tennessee. Thanks again for my co-researcher and area photographer, Aslan McNew, for supplying photographs, local tales, and also some cultural context. And with that, let's begin a short trip from the world of the rational into the realm of shadow reality. The South has a reputation for a fascination with ghosts. The images of cypress-filled groves, swamps, sprawling fields, and brooding mountains all evoke a sense of great forlorn antiquity. The inescapable history, embedded slave culture, and some of the grimmest fighting of the American Civil War have leaked a residue of sadness and nostalgia. And where there is sadness and nostalgia, there are ghosts. Whether these are literal traces of the past given form, or a resonance in the collective psyche of the people who live there, in the South, ghosts are real, and often they are spoken of, in parlors, bars, and at firesides. There is a strong folkloric heritage inherited from the South's earliest European settlers. The Irish, Scottish, English, and Welsh brought a rich tradition of ghost stories, some of which descended directly from the late Middle Ages. Much of it had developed alongside the Victorian obsession with ghosts, fairies, and devils. Stripped of the superstitious fear of discussing such things, unlike the Puritan-dominated North, there seems to have been much more of an embedded early history of ghost story culture in the South. There are two other cultural factors that can't be overlooked. The Southern settlers fused their own beliefs with those of the indigenous Native Americans. In one account that we will examine at length in the next episode, a commingling of European settler and native accounts becomes evident. It seems that this is not only unidirectional. In some cases, a later account then informs newer Native American mythology. It can't be discounted that the Afro-Caribbean and Southern American cultural influence, brought by slaves, also overlaid the cosmology of the European immigrants. Practical folklore, religion, and native mysticism creates a hybrid mythology unique to these newly settled lands. Folktales have a way of bleeding together and interweaving, creating a hybrid, or a story that is entirely new. It was recounted to me by Aslan that in her family, the story of Bloody Bones was a common boogeyman tale. She was told by her grandfather that Bloody Bones was hiding in the attic, the kind of attic with the pull-down stairs, and that if she went up there alone, he'd get her. This was a familiar tale in the family. Her mother was similarly scared by stories of bloody bones as a child. It was, again, a creature living in an attic, with pull-down stairs. Many other family members also recount similar stories being told to them to terrorize them as children. Bloody Bones comes from an Old English folktale. An old nursery rhyme describes this goblin and his predilections. Rawhead and Bloody Bones steals naughty children from their homes, takes them to his dirty den, and they are never seen again. I only knew the legend of Rawhead and Bloody Bones from Old World lore. It wasn't until talking to Aslan that I was told he made not infrequent appearances in Appalachia. A few descriptions of the creature appear, painting him as a goblin of sorts. He would often live in a cupboard or other space under the stairs. He is described as a gangly, hunched creature with long limbs, perhaps not unlike Gollum from Lord of the Rings, or similar creatures from fantasy and folklore. He is often reported as having glaring eyes, rows of fangs, and blood running down his face. The story is if you could avoid seeing him, he couldn't get you. But if you even peeped through the cupboard keyhole and glimpsed those glaring eyes, Bloody Bones could somehow reach out and draw you in, and you would never be seen again. The Cornish version is known as Old Bloody Bones, and he often had a companion, Rawhead, a monster with a face like a stripped skull. In many cases, they are different creatures that are paired, with Bloody Bones literally being a bloody skeleton that accompanied Rawhead on his forays. But sometimes Rawhead and Bloody Bones is the same creature, combining the grisly qualities of both. Some of the oldest English traditions portray Bloody Bones as a sort of elemental, a troll inhabiting ponds and marshy areas that stalks and drowns children who get too close. And it appears that in the New World, he isn't unique to Chattanooga. Georgia and Carolina have variations of Bloody Bones, Rawhead, and the combined monster. In some places, it is as a creature that comes, as is often the case in folklore, to reinforce some sort of morality. He is portrayed as a revenant of sorts, a person who lost their head through accident, murder, or execution. And he often has a similar role of a creature that would punish those who had committed a social transgression. In one story, he would come and devour those who had lied to or betrayed a lover. The victim of the attack would then also walk, undead and eternally bleeding. There we find the familiar folkloric, vengeful, or damning ghost. A few Appalachian tales, and even a few of the early Cornish accounts, describe the creature as a sort of kobold or knocker, a being that lives in mines and quarries, particularly if these out-of-the-way underground places were filled with water. Again, we see the creature attached to water, especially standing and stagnant water. The oldest English accounts seem to ascribe a sort of hobgoblin status to the thing, a creature that dwells in the cracks between reality, right under the noses of humanity. The fact that in Chattanooga he seems to like addicts with pull-down stairs echoes this role. What is perhaps most interesting to the current discourse is that it seems tales of the creature were much more common, or at least more widespread in the colonial South. And it seems it became interwoven with Afro-Caribbean lore, particularly among the Gula. These were African Americans who lived in the low country regions of Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. Their long-standing Old World and Caribbean belief in malevolent ancestor spirits, haunts, or a pantheon dialectually known as haints, adopted Bloody Bones as a natural addition to their supernatural collection. And when they went north, they brought these tales with them. A similar trend can be seen in folk art and music. I know from personal experience several relatively obscure historic instruments, such as the hurdy-gurdy, are played accompanied by the singing of traditional songs in Old and Middle English, and this still persists in Appalachia today. It seems in the South, roots are deep, and memory lingers just a little bit longer. Our stories today sadly won't include first-hand run-ins with Rawhead and Bloody Bones, or any other well-known specter. You'll have to wait for the next episode for a more famous apparition. But these stories are no less significant, as they accent both the local history and the flavor of Chattanooga. The first set of stories are from a local who goes by the name of Paps. In one of his earliest brushes with the supernatural, Paps recounts living in a house where in the middle of the night he would often have a strange visitor. A man in old clothing would come through the door of the room. He seemed to be relatively nondescript and middle-aged. His wardrobe denoted a working-class traveler. The man kept offering him shoes. As a young boy, this was mystifying to Paps. His mother could have written this off as childhood imagination, except for his insistence and consistency when retelling the story. When asking a neighbor, Paps' mother was told that the house was originally a general store, and in fact, the owner was well known for a particular skill. He was, wait for it, a cobbler, and his specialty was in selling shoes. Paps recounted a similar tale while living in another house some years later. Each night he would have a dream that a Native American man in antique tribal garb would emerge from the bedroom closet. This man would simply stare at the child, not maliciously, but in a strangely curious fashion. Paps mentioned this dream encounter to several relatives, and his uncle had a spark of memory. He took Paps for a walk around the property. Behind the house, they found one of the local Native American burial mounds in the woods, only about 100 yards away. The last tale from Paps involves an encounter he had much later in life. He tagged along with a buddy to a new friend's house. They began to party and apparently became rather debauched. As his friends continued to lay themselves lower and lower into a stupor, Paps found himself being admonished by an elderly woman who had entered from another room. She began to chastise Paps and the other young men for their wicked lifestyle and wasting so much of their time. At first, Paps attempted to dissuade and ignore the woman, but she remained and was insistent. Her tone became more and more agitated. More to Paps' amazement, it appeared that neither of the other two men could see her, or that they were somehow totally ignoring her. And she then focused her full attention on Paps. Finally, Paps asked his new friend who this woman was, and asked if she could leave. The man quickly seemed to sober up and replied that it was his grandmother. She had been dead for over a year. But in life, she disapproved of his decadent lifestyle, and more than once he had had dreams of her, and she continued to express her disapproval of his lack of direction and clean living. If you had not already surmised, Paps was locally known and self-acknowledged as a medium. While he never applied his skills professionally, Paps was one of those rare people who somehow attracts and can at least on some level communicate with spirits. When dealing with mediumship, it is always asked, how much of it is imagination? As we've discussed in previous episodes, there seems to be, for some people, a fine line between perceptions that are literal or psychic. Sometimes Paps would see and interact with these spirits in either the awakened or sleeping state. In other incidences, he would only sense something nearby, and images would form in his mind. Paps traces his ancestry back to his Louisiana Redbone roots. His personal and family history was no stranger to tales of ghosts, strange creatures, and odd happenings. The Redbones are a mixed ethnicity culture, most prominent in southwestern Louisiana. Some of the oldest settlers who claimed a Redbone stock came from South Carolina, but Redbone families have since spread to other regions in the South. They claim heritage from African, European, and Native American roots in no single determination. This exemplifies our earlier discussion on the very nature of the South. The blend of cultures seems to inherently leave open more doors, more shadowy gateways into worlds beyond our sight. Our last tale comes from Danny and Claire, a modest working-class couple, who recounted several accounts of strange happenings. These culminated in this encounter in 1988. Before moving into the house on North Crest Road, neither Danny or Claire had any deep interest in the paranormal. They had a son, Trent, who was about to enter middle school, and the family was looking forward to enjoying this spacious house and surroundings outdoors. The house was old. Like most houses on the Ridge, as the locals call it, it dated from at least the end of the previous century. It was part of several sprawling farms and homesteads that often dated back to before the Civil War. But old homes, even old homes on forlorn properties, aren't uncommon in the area, and initially the family didn't have any particular reason to feel uneasy. Shortly after they moved in, Claire did indeed begin to feel uneasy in the house. There would often be the sense of being watched, and not alone even when she was the only one at home. Occasional strange bumps and sounds, vaguely like footsteps, could be heard. At one point, Trent recalls seeing the apparition of a man in old clothing moving around the house, and while startling, the presence didn't seem threatening. It wasn't clear to Trent if this was an intelligent spirit or simply a phantom, an imprint out of time that he was somehow able to perceive. The latter possibility is reinforced by perhaps the strangest experience Claire and Dan reported on the property. Late one night, they were awakened by the sound of a nearby gunshot. Even emerging from sleep, they sensed it was outside, possibly from the yard. As they oriented themselves, they heard the peculiar sound of water and movement within the room. A woman stood not far from the bed, against a wall, washing her hands in a sink. The peculiarity of the apparition was heightened by the fact that there was no sink in the bedroom, and this woman's clothes were distinctly dated from an earlier era. Startled, confused, and amazed, the couple sat up and reached for the bedside lamp. As the room became illuminated, the specter vanished. They discussed this incident in daylight. It appeared that the clothes of the apparition were from the turn of the century or shortly thereafter. Upon inquiring about the property, they were told another family had lived on the homestead, that there had indeed been a murder somewhere around the turn of the century. According to the story, a married couple lived there, and after some time it became apparent that the husband was cheating on his wife. One night she awaited his return on the lawn with a pistol, and when he arrived late, disheveled, and without explanation, she shot him dead on the lawn. She then proceeded to go inside the house, upstairs to where the old bathroom was originally located, and washed her hands, waiting for the police to arrive. These stories just scratch the surface of local tales and anecdotes. From personal accounts to slices of local lore, each of these stories represents not only the human history, but the history of the land itself sustained throughout the years. They speak to a communal, if not ancestral psyche, rooted deep in the soil around Chattanooga. The next episode will talk a bit about one of the area's well-known, most enduring, and complex ghost stories. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed these strange personal accounts. Please like the video, assuming you do. Subscribe to the channel and share these videos if you like them. I'm interested in any comments you have, and don't hesitate to say hello. You can also find us at www.mirkwood.com, that's Mirkwood with a Y, and on Facebook at our Mirkwood Tales page. Audio-only versions of the podcast are available at mirkwoodtales.podbean.com, iTunes, and other major streaming sites if you search for Mirkwood Tales. If you are listening to a podcast version of this, search for the video channel on YouTube called Mirkwood Tales. You'll get some additional content with the visuals. This episode, for example, has some original photos by Aslan, who also supplied these stories. Got a tale you want to share with me and my listeners? Send me an email at tales@mirkwood.com or through private message over at the Facebook page. Be safe, best wishes, and stay strange.